Hey guys, my name is Micah Fort, and today I'm going to be doing the discussion lead for William Faulkner's short story called A Rose for Emily. Just a little bit about the author. Faulkner's kind of described as a mainstay of 20th century literature. Some evidence for that is the fact that I am aware of his name, and my bookshelf doesn't run all that deep. In this story, he does a wonderful job of exploiting timelines. Um, as well as introducing a really just a very interesting character in Miss Emily. The most interesting elements in the story to me are his character development as well as the point of view of the narrator. In his efforts to describe the general feel of the townspeople in regards to Miss Emily, um, he just does a great job of kind of giving an honest perception of what it is they view her as being. And also, it's really interesting, he never actually names the character for which narrates the story. That's really interesting to me because I just haven't seen that often. So that was one of the kind of sticking points for me. But the story opens on the funeral of Miss Emily, which is held in her own home. The entire town seems to be in attendance. There's an especially large emphasis on the amount of men who are there, which is kind of a great foreshadowing because we see her in the future as a woman who hasn't had a lot of human interactions, especially male interactions. So her funeral is kind of a symbolic shaping up of a hinting that the old ways were kind of dying, as well as Miss Emily herself with her passing, because she was a woman of great reputation within the community, or at least her family was in the past. The home itself is described as an eyesore in relationship to the rest of the town, which had given way to gas pumps and cotton wagons in the story. And it's described to be kind of stubborn, which shapes up with the reputation of its owner and her perception within the community. We read about the past confrontations next with city officials over her tax situation. After describing Emily as the type of woman who wouldn't accept charity, General Sartoris remitted her taxes under the guise of an old debt that the town owed her father, which is kind of a hint at the past in the way that things used to operate. And it's described as something that could have only happened with someone who had lived in that time period. Some years after the general's passing, the town officials now seek to collect taxes from Miss Emily. And after many attempts to correspond with her, city officials now show up to her home, which is described as decaying, as is its contents and the owner herself, kind of revealing that grandeur that's lost to time. We see this first step back in the timeline, and it reveals Miss Emily to be bloated and yet having a small skeleton. So we're kind of getting a picture of her being a withering person. We also see a headstrong woman who isn't prepared to offer even a nickel to the city, as after multiple attempts to reason with her, she is seen repeating herself, I have no taxes in Jefferson. And when they repeat that they are the officials, they are the record keepers, they're the ones who are saying you do have taxes in Jefferson, she just repeatedly states, see General Sartoris, whom we quickly find out has been dead for many years. So she's just a headstrong character. This is one of my favorite parts of the text, as it reveals her strength and the fact that she's bound to her father's image. Even through just the general's remitting of her taxes, she is very much ingrained in who her father was within the community. This is also evidenced by the highlighting of his portrait in this scene, made or painted by Miss Emily herself, I believe in Crown. And the story of Emily not telling authorities of his passing for a number of days kind of also ties that into the general proceeding and feel of the story. After her father's passing, she's seen consorting with Homer Barron, a man known to be a bit of a adulterer, philanderer type, as well as a northerner within the community. Basically, just in the South, he's a man of ill repute and well below her class and her station, albeit a charismatic person. The man's storyline's relatively brief within the story, as the townspeople call Emily's cousins to kind of save her from herself after they learn though, that she did purchase him a personalized toiletry set, they then make an attempt to run off the cousins and are successful in doing so. And after this, we see Miss Emily going to the drugstore very shortly after, as Homer had kind of fled town while the cousins were in town as to avoid this confrontation. And the scene in the drugstore is fantastic. So that's one of the highlights I'm going to be starting with. It starts with Miss Emily saying, "I want arsenic." The druggist looked down at her. She looked back at him, erect, her face like a strained flag. "Why, of course," the druggist said, "if that's what you want. But the law requires that you tell me what you're going to use it for." Miss Emily just stared at him, her head tilted back in order to look him eye for eye, until he looked away and went to get the arsenic and wrapped it up. The delivery boy brought her the package. The druggist did not come back. When she opened the package at home, there was written on the box, under the skull and bones, "For rats." This is awesome to me. Just continuing to show the character's strength in that section. Everyone assumes that the poison will be for Miss Emily to finally kill herself, which is actually described as being the best thing, which kind of shows the prominence and the viewing of the time as well as the character herself. We find that's not the case. Shortly after, Homer's seen entering Miss Emily's home. This is the last time either character is seen for several months, or in Homer's case, ever. She's later seen, after she does emerge from her home, as having gained weight, hair turned gray, which is fantastic foreshadowing because this seems to have happened pretty quickly. After years pass, we see Miss Emily refusing to get a mailbox as the times and the population around her is kind of starting to get younger and, kind of evolve. They call it progression of the town, which is also highlighted by her not wanting to get the mailbox, is that she's just defiant to the end. So the next section, or the next part I want to highlight is kind of once we get back into this section of the timeline to where we opened, which is actually at the funeral. For a long while, we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of that nightshirt, had become inextractable from the bed in which he lay, and upon him and upon the pillow beside him lay that even coating of the patient and biting dust. So this is describing Homer once we enter the forbidden upstairs room and find his body. Then we notice, going back into the section now, then we notice in the second pillow there was an indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, the faint and invisible dust dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of gray hair. So only in this final scene do we really come to understand Miss Emily. She's been restrained by the actions of her father, by the history of her family, and by the social graces of the time in the town. So after this final scene, seeing the dust-covered wedding outfit of Homer and a more close examination, the discovery of Miss Emily's hairs on the pillow next to him, we find that this was how she found comfort. She'd been isolated by a father and had little reality with which she was happy. She finally committed murder and covered it up with using her position within the community. And this is how she found companionship. It was with the dead, not the living, which is, again, really interesting. it's a little dark ending for what we've seen throughout this, and it does a great job of really catching me by surprise. There's a lot of parts of this I've either abbreviated or neglected. I'm not going to keep us here as long as it would require. I've already kept us here too long. So let's get into the questions. Number one, what's the significance in the chronology found in the story's timeline? Do you find this to be a positive aspect in that it draws intrigue, or is this more of a detractor from the story in your eyes? Who do you think is the narrator? And this is pretty open-ended. It could be almost anyone. that's been there a while. It's likely an elderly person who's known Emily and the family for many years, and they regard them with class and disdain at times. Considering the narrator never condemns Emily, is it likely that the actions of the family itself is leading the narrator to describe them as having as held themselves a little too high? Do you believe the average person was so interested in Emily, or did this person possibly have more personal connections with the family? Number four, after Emily's death, the narrator says, "At last, we could pity Miss Emily." What does this tell you about how she was viewed by not only the narrator but the town? And then last question, do you think this affected the way Emily lived her life? Explain the role of Southern nobility or its implications in the situation, or even kind of small town lore and lifestyle that played a part in her life. So, all right, guys, sorry for the long one. Good luck. Hope everybody enjoyed the story.